All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Fair in Medicine's webinar on our informed consent. And we are continuing our series on informed consent. And tonight we're going to be talking about the first of our vaccine part of the series. But just a quick reminder, Fair in Medicine is a wing of Fair for All. You can find us at fairforall.org. We are a nonprofit organization that is geared toward really basically trying to bring us all together as one human being to another, giving factual information and just really trying to spread truth and humanity. So Fair in Medicine is specifically geared to do all of those things in the realm of medicine. We have decided to sort of branch out from specifically talking about gender issues and DEI. We still will be concluding those issues in our topics, but we really want to dive into some of the problems that have been causing distrust in the medical system in the first place, and what we think is the root cause for issues that are so prominent, like the gender issues. Informed consent is a central component of developing trust in the doctor-patient relationship. It's the process by which patients are given information about all of the possible benefits, all the possible risks, and alternatives to a specific either medical treatment, a procedure, test, or a clinical trial. The purpose really is to provide our patients with all of the information necessary for them to make an educated decision with their care team about either their medical care or their participation in research. So the health professionals who are providing this informed consent should be, one, fully knowledgeable about all of this information, and they ought to be fully transparent and available to answer all of the patient's questions. We're at a point where we have an estimate that there's about 30% of Americans who are concerned about the risks of the medications that they have been prescribed by their health professional. They either don't know what those risks are, or they're uncomfortable with the risks and may not take their medicines because of that reason. And that's a huge problem, especially in a country that has a lot of people with chronic medical illnesses and a lot of illnesses or health issues that are completely preventable. Vaccines are one of the ways that we are trained to help prevent diseases. Is one of the tools in our arsenal to help us prevent illness. But unfortunately, the lack of transparency about true effects of all of our medications, including most recently COVID RNA and messenger RNA vaccines, puberty blockers, sex hormones for gender dysphoria, prescription opioids, and benzodiazepines have a lot of us distrusting the medical system. A lot of people, including myself, distrusting people who have taught us, people who we thought were respected scientists and that we trusted to get this information from. Particularly concerning is the skepticism about the safety of childhood vaccinations has really grown, really in the past decade or so. If not a lot longer than that. The most prominent concern has been parents raising questions about autism and whether or not those are related to specific vaccines, namely the diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, that kind of combined vaccines, and the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. We're not here to argue about any of those kind of controversial issues, but we're here to really try to get you information so that you can be fully informed. You can understand when your health professional may not be giving you all of the answers to those questions that are concerning to you, or ask, be able to ask the questions that you need to ask in order to make these decisions about you and also your child. So despite looming questions about safety, the rapid approval of these COVID-19 mRNA vaccines for children has led more parents to questioning the safety of all recommended vaccines. So just one period of uncertainty and lack of transparency has created it's caused a drop in the percentage of children who are entering kindergarten, at least that we know of, because it's not a requirement for every school to report vaccination numbers, but we know that since about 2014, there's been a drop from about 95% to 93%. So 2%, may not seem a lot to you, but that's a lot of children going to school without all of their vaccine. So we're going to start tonight and talk about the human papilloma virus vaccine, or HPV virus vaccine. And I am lucky to have some friends and colleagues who I've worked with before here who can give us the information about these vaccines. So first, I have Allison Krug. She is an epidemiologist, but she's also a certified professional coach, specializing in the high performance and health and well-being and relationships, career transitions. Just like, she's really transformed who she is, which is like completely amazing. But especially for families with neurodiverse children. Alli is the founder and CEO of Artemis Biomedical Communications, LLC. It's a consultancy specializing in research, analysis, and medical writing. She is very intuitive and a collaborative scientist. If I have questions about something that I need extreme detail about, she's one of the people that I go to for that. So I'm excited to have her here. And Dr. Ram Duriseti is a mostly pediatric emergency medicine physician who got his MD.
Adult and peds.
Okay, all right.
I don't do much peds anymore, just
Not
outside of
anymore.
my general
Okay,
practice.
all right. But you have done peds, right?
For a very long time, yes.
Okay, got it. All right. But anyway, so thank you for that transparency. But you received your MD from the University of Michigan, your medical training, and your PhD in computational decision modeling from Stanford, correct? And you've been practicing in either community or academic settings for at least over 20 years, right? All right. And I've gotten to work with both of these wonderful scientists and professionals in urgency of normal during COVID. And our purpose was to bring you some truth around the science around COVID policies. And so this is the continuation of that relationship. So specifically diving in on the HPV vaccine. Welcome to you guys. All right. Let's see. So we're going to get started. So first of all, and either of you can chime in at any time. And if you think of something that may look like, that may just seem like it's off topic, but it comes up, and just go ahead and bring it up. This is really free for all, very informal conversation, but we will kind of get through some of the questions and the big topics that we talked about beforehand. So what is the HPV vaccine? When was it first licensed and approved by the FDA?
I guess I can take that. Nikki, thank you so much for the warm introduction. And Ram, it's really a pleasure to be back here collaborating with you again. Ram is definitely the person to go to if you really want a thoughtful reply and some critical thinking about what we know and what we don't know. I really love working with Ram. He's always very energetic about taking on questions and really digging into them. So as for me, I just wanted to add to your amazing introduction that, I'm a mom. That's what got me into asking these
Yeah.
questions. I'm a mom of two teenage boys. And during the pandemic, when the vaccines were first given emergency use authorization, I was, wondering, is this a good choice for young, healthy athletes, which is why I'm at a hockey rink parking lot. My apologies, but that is just how the schedule is. So, does this make sense? And that question is really one that I think motivates Ram and me and others to do the quality risk benefit analyses that are so essential to what you're proposing tonight, which is transparent conversation around risks and benefits and reestablishing trust in our providers to be able to provide us with that information as parents. So that's what motivated me. Is simply the question, does this make sense for my child? The HPV vaccine, there's two, Gardasil and Cervarix. Gardasil was authorized in 2006. We now have Gardasil 9, and the approval has been extended through clinical trials as well as extensions of those trials looking at immunogenicity for ages 9 to 26 and also ages 27 to 45. However, I should note that it's not necessarily recommended for those older age groups, but that would be a shared decision-making based on risk.
Okay, so I remember I was actually, yeah, I was pregnant when Gardasil first came on the market, and I was just, wow, like this is really cool. I mean, having trained, seeing women with cervical cancer, which is, one of the things that we do have excellent screening for, but we did not have really a great way to prevent it. And so it was exciting to see it come. But I really didn't know a lot about, a lot of information. And I wasn't in a field where I was in general pediatrics where I was going to be recommending it, but oftentimes people ask me questions. And so what really was the data that was present for them to approve that? And what did we have any idea of the numbers of children, at least, who would go on to develop cervical cancer? Were we able to predict that before, creating this vaccine and then deciding to approve it?
So I thank you for the introduction, and Alli, it's great to see you. We've met before and we'll meet again. But so I have to say that as a general rule, I'm going to defer to Alli on a lot of specific points about the HPV vaccine. She's done a lot more digging on this topic than I have. It hasn't been a particular area of interest of mine. I have two very young children from my current marriage who are not on the cusp of that vaccine. I have two older children who have had every recommended vaccine, and my two younger children have as well. Except for the COVID vaccine, which I think my oldest, he made his own choice, whatever he made. My teen got a single dose, and neither of my two youngest are going to be getting a dose in the near future. So there are reasons for that we can get into, and it's not exactly the topic of discussion, but I think that what struck me sort of reading about this topic in sort of some preparation for this panel discussion was that there's nothing about the HPV vaccines that I have read that justify dogmatic statements from either side. Nothing. The incidence of dysplasia at very young ages is very low. So if you're talking about vaccinating children in their preteens or early teens, and you're trying to look at the incidence of dysplasia 10 years out or more, you're looking at, in an unvaccinated cohort, I think about 2 per 100,000, or I can pull up the graph from the CDC data by this age group, by the early 20s, which is a very low number. So the absolute risk without vaccination in cohorts that we've seen in the past is very low, because dysplasia like this takes years, decades to develop. So in terms of
we're talking about cervical dysplasia, correct? Okay, all right.
Well, cervical, but you can also, I've looked at, for example, the plots around. I mean, they have peak incidence for different types, cervical, anal, oropharyngeal, vaginal, and vulvar.
Okay.
They have these peak incidence rates from various cohorts historically. So they have this data. So the point is that if you look at peak incidence of these diseases like true dysplasia, for men and women, you're talking around the 50s and then 60s for men, a little bit older for men. So, what is it going to do for the long-term epidemiologist? I don't know if anyone knows. I think there are reasonable conclusions drawn around immunogenicity. What do antibodies do to decrease the rate of persistent infection? And persistent infection being correlate for how people develop dysplasia. I think we do know that. And we have some pretty good data on that, and we are able to make some reasonable inference about that. And so we'd like to say that, yeah, it seems like there would be a clear benefit, but the absolute risks are low.
Yeah.
And the absolute risks are also extremely low for adverse events, but not non-existent, right? And this goes back to my point. Dogmatic statements on either side don't really carry a lot of water in this conversation. Not yet. Maybe 20 years from now, they will.
Yeah. So, if we're going back, so we're going back to 2006 when it was first introduced, Gardasil, like what information did we have to, actually even go, through this process and to justify any risk of the vaccine itself? Was it just, okay, hey, we don't have a way to prevent these types of cancers, and this may be a way, so it justifies the risks? Or like what was the decision making like? And I mean, obviously I wasn't, I mean, I was alive, but I didn't look at the FDA panels or CDC panels and advisory groups who made the recommendation. I wasn't able to look at the literature that was presented by the pharmaceutical companies. And so how does a person, it's a parent who is faced with this information, or even a physician who is seeing this for the first time, go through the information and decide whether or not this is something that's worth recommending, and then one, and then two, safe to recommend? And I'm really trying to get at like the approval process, and for people who just don't understand that process. I guess that's what I'm trying to get.
Alli, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think getting into the weeds on the epidemiology might be not as interesting right now, but I will say that the concern is justified. Cervical cancer is in the top 10, certainly, cancers among females. I have an image that I can share with your listeners that shows estimated new cases and estimated deaths in males and females for all the top cancers. And certainly, pharmaceutical companies go after things that are affecting lots of us, right? Because that makes sense. It just doesn't make sense to go after things that are not going to have follow-on usage that justifies all of the upfront research costs and maintaining that pipeline. I used to work for Merck Vaccine Division, and I actually hold the company in really high regard. I really had exceptional training, worked there for 3 years, and called on pediatric offices. So I'm not here as an anti-vaxxer, nor even anti-pharma. As a matter of fact, I really am thankful that we do have excellent scientists and people who are really committed to research and development. But I think what I would say, in alignment.
Before you continue on, I want to just piggyback on that. And I think that's a great point that people often miss. I know that there's a lot of distrust and a lot of reasons to have distrust for people. And so, but, without these companies, we wouldn't have a lot of very valuable tools in our arsenal to help not only prevent disease, but also to treat disease. So this is really, really important. the science, the people who do the science and the people who do the caring, or, you know, and the treating are really important in this equation. So there's good and bad people in every single group, but the overall goal is obviously to create things that are actually useful to our existence. So that is important for us to say, and it's clear. Like I am in the same camp as you. I'm not completely anti-pharma. I am not completely anti-vax, but I want people to have, you know, the information. So
yeah.
So all
right. Yeah. Thank you for underscoring that. I mean, 100%. And I think that it's unfortunate in some ways that we are where we are, you know, where people are, you know, their trust in medicine is at an all-time low, arguably. And I've seen confidence rates drop from 70 to about half of that, 30 to 40% in one of the estimates, based on provider recommendation for various preventive screenings and vaccinations. So that's really concerning, because provider recommendation is the #1 motivator for people to do what we really hope they'll do to take care of themselves. My background is also in preventive health and program management. That's where I brought my epi degree first, was into managed care and trying to reduce barriers to preventive care. Like, I am all about getting people in for vaccines, for mammograms, et cetera. So I think that the challenging situation here is the trade-offs, right? And this is what got me really fascinated with the COVID vaccines as well. And like Ram, we don't have to go over there and talk about that unless you want to, but
we'll talk about that on another webinar.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that some other time. But you know, the point here is the adverse events are really low. But as Ram was saying, the absolute risk reduction is also very low. And so if we're not careful, we're going to find that for every one case of cervical cancer that we prevent, we might be causing one serious adverse event. And based on the adverse event rate, the serious adverse event rate in the package insert, which is 0.04%, that's 1 in 2,500. We need to balance that against the number needed to vaccinate to prevent one case of invasive cervical cancer. We don't have really good estimates there. And I think that's what really motivates me as a pretty humble, pretty honest scientist. I'm not an expert, but I do have questions. And we need to have a good number needed to vaccinate to balance out against that number needed to harm. You know, is it a trade-off of really like closer to 1-to-1? Is it 2-to-1? The number needed to vaccinate that you could calculate from an overall rate in the Lay et al. Swedish study, which a lot of people reference, is 2,300. So that is an interesting number to compare to 1 in 2,500 people getting a serious adverse event. And I think that that is what gets people like me and Ram. You know, Ram has a tremendous background in computational modeling, and others, mathematicians, interested in, let's really look at the probability here, because many of these studies, and this is going off in a little cul-de-sac here, but it's an important one, we're not actually really looking at who is at highest risk for these things. And then breaking the population down and breaking the recommendations down from a universal, everybody should get it, everyone should get 3 doses, to, hey, you know, if you have these risk factors, this really makes sense for you. And if you don't have these risk factors, maybe the trade-off isn't as good. And that's what gets me fascinated and motivates me to do research with in collaboration with these other great people.
So let's go back to, okay, so we had Gardasil, you know, the Gardasil, and then in 2014, you know, they changed it. They made it a multivalent version of this. So why did that happen? How did that happen? What happened in that first almost 10-year period?
Well, I mean, they're looking at the top strains, right, that are causing problems for women, right? So what they're doing is looking to add strains. What the vaccine actually does is it has virus-like particles, and they assemble on their own and into the major capsid protein of the HPV virus, L1, and that stimulates the immune system to go and develop antibodies to that protein. So that's what they're trying to do. And so they're sticking more and more targets in there. So the immune system is like, oh, hello, I see these top 9 ones that we think are a major problem. So I'm not sure if you want to go further with that, but that's what
no. I want to, and because what I'm trying to do, because we have a mixed audience here. We got a mixed audience of, like, you know, really, you know, professional people who are scientists, who are physicians, but we also have people who don't really understand how this process works. So, I as much as we can get into, you know, a little bit of the weeds, I kind of want people to get some of this information. So you start off with one, and you went to a, you know, a 9-valent one. It wasn't because the first one, you know, caused a lot of problems. It was because we found more information, correct? And that we felt like we could target all of the viruses that were causing the problem.
Yeah, they're
better,
trying to
which is
grab the
that.
top group that
Okay,
accounts for somewhere around 70% of cervical cancers. So they're,
got it.
yeah.
Okay, all right. So I want to make sure people understand that there was not a problem, you know, with the first one, major side effects, and then they had to come up with something different. Okay.
But
And so then,
going back to your question about, you know, what happened in 2006, I mean, I think I speak
yeah,
for all of us here in that I don't think any of us had any questions back in 2006. This wasn't something
yeah,
we were talking about or looking at. It was just recommended and it came out. And I think that for the large part, as a physician, I've had, um, you know, good faith, reasonable faith, I should say, in our regulatory agencies. You know, what you said earlier, I don't have a universal suspicion or disregard for pharma companies. If I'm going to be opposed to something, though, I'm going to be opposed of what I call far too cozy relationship between industry and regulatory agencies.
yeah,
And so it's not reasonable to ask every physician to go out and evaluate every single intervention in terms of its risks and benefits and to have that conversation with the patient at the point of care. It's not practical, it's not realistic, it's not even good practice. And I'll tell you why, because the vast majority of physicians are not equipped to analyze the literature and have that conversation. They can't. So they just default to, well, so-and-so recommends it. And it's not a cop-out, it's what they're comfortable with. And in fact, I prefer them saying that than saying, well, I've had vast experience, and therefore you see this degree, that's why. So I actually prefer that. So that doesn't give the patient a whole lot of comfort. I can get that. But I do think the path forward is actually to have more honest conversations and more honest informational pamphlets for people, things that are broken down that explain both sides of the equation, kind of similar to what I was opening with, which is that, yeah, there are these adverse events. They're incredibly rare. What is your potential risk? Also very low. You know, but when you're asking what kind of faith did we have in this? I mean, we had knowledge about the immunogenicity, and most of these vaccines are approved primarily based upon their immunogenicity, right? And in this particular case, we have an immediate like adverse events at the point of administration, and they're not necessarily followed over any period of time. I'm not even sure there's a standard for the standard follow-up. It might be just 30 days, Alli, if I'm not mistaken. But having said all that, you know, we have immunogenicity. Do we get antibodies or not? Then we have, are antibodies helpful? Yeah, it seems like they're kind of helpful as far as we can tell. In terms of age of administration, we know that younger kids, as well as women who are pregnant, have changes in the cervix that are most, and in those states, they are most susceptible to incorporation of the virus into the DNA, which ultimately leads to dysplasia. So we have these facts, and we have something that generates antibodies, and we know antibodies can be a very good thing. They can also be a bad thing in certain situations. And so, yeah, that's what this was based upon. That seemed reasonable. I think the problem is not so much taking that leap and moving forward. If we ask for everything to be evaluated on a 10 to 15 to 20-year horizon before we actually approve its use, there are a lot of lives lost in that, potentially lost in that time period, which could have been saved. And not just lives lost, but morbidity prevented. Hysterectomies, major, even if it's curative, major rounds of chemotherapy or surgery, whatever, list goes on.
yeah.
So I don't think that's necessarily the right approach, but I do think more circumspect language, more humility, more intellectual curiosity are always warranted. And if you demonstrate those traits, people will still take it with the doubt that you present. Right? I mean, good or bad, I'm not making a value statement on that, but you can have an impact while being honest. It's shocking, but true.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the real you hit a lot of points that I think are really, really important. So first of all, yes, there are numerous doctors who have no idea how to interpret complex scientific information. And we there is, concern about transparency given the cozy relationship with pharma and our government regulatory agencies. So we don't, I think a lot of the concern or the lack of confidence comes from that relationship, to tell you the truth, more than anything. And so if you can't trust the people who are saying, let's approve this because they may be getting a kickback from the pharmaceutical company, then you also can't trust your physician or the person who is prescribing it, because those people may not have access to all of the information about that particular drug. But as long as they're honest about it, I think a lot of people respect that. And if you can say, I don't have all of the data available to me, I can tell you this is what I know. This is what is available. This is the disease that we would like to prevent. This is the incidence of getting that disease, or you or your child getting that disease in the future. And then this is what we're projected to be able to prevent. And then these are the risks that go along with that we know. But there is a chance that, years from now, we may learn more information about this particular pharmaceutical agent, this drug, or this vaccine, whatever it is, that may or may not make it favorable. And we may have to pull it from the market. But, and I don't always think that it's really fair for physicians to put families, in a position where they like really have to, make a choice. But if this is what you have available, that's the alternative, is not taking it at all, right? And taking the risk. And so as long as you're honest with everything I think people have a lot more respect for that, and trust in you, to help them make the decisions, if you are honest. And compared to, you must take this, you are going to create a disease burden in society if you don't take this. And
Yeah,
you're right.
exactly this.
No,
Yeah, and well, it's more that somehow each individual has a societal responsibility separate from their own responsibility for their health or that of their child, which is then becomes a value judgment and also becomes a hammer. So, prior to COVID, if you were to ask me, are you in support of vaccine mandates? I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? That would have been a completely uncritical response, because I had a fairly high level of confidence in people's ability to make reasonable decisions and recommendations around this and not violate reasonable bounds of ethics. We all have probably some different notions. But now I'm willing to say, yeah, I actually understand the epidemiologic importance of herd immunity thresholds for measles. I understand that dipping below those thresholds have demonstrated higher disease transmission in the community. I understand that children under an age of immunization are susceptible as well as others, and by having more floating around, that's a risk to those people. But this has to be balanced against an ethical consideration. There's no calculus for that, by the way. There is no number that says, oh, well, this 6-month-old being exposed to measles is worth X, and you taking it is worth Y, and your Y is less than their X. There's no formula for this. Okay, so fundamentally, this is not going to be solved with a number. It has to be sort of optimizing, in my opinion, the epidemiologic impact, while also maintaining some very clear ethical boundaries about what we do and don't do with people. And they're completely different metrics, completely different metrics. And so, just to make a hard example, I have a 4.5-year-old who's going to be starting kindergarten, and I just realized that, as we're finishing his immunization record, that he hasn't had his second MMR and his second varicella. I'm like, oh, okay. And it just, there's no scheduled visit between 4 to 60 years old. So we never really got it. And all right, we'll go do it. And we're going to go do it tomorrow. But I have to wonder, were the first doses not enough for societal impact? I'm curious. I
I
don't
can
know,
talk about that.
actually.
Yeah,
Well, yeah.
Some of those are two Merck vaccines.
Yeah.
And,
I mean,
that's
these are
it's a
real
great
questions.
question.
I haven't researched it, but this was immediate. Like this happened today, and I'm like, gosh, how interesting we're having this conversation today, because I don't think that again, I haven't looked into it, and I'm not necessarily going to right now. He's going to go ahead and get his second doses and whatever.
Yeah.
But I know enough to know that neither is, sterilizing immunity is a relative metric. There's no such thing as 100% sterilizing immunity. I think the closest that we can get to that is maybe hepatitis B, maybe that vaccine. But, and that's with repeated doses. But eventually you get there. But I don't know.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question, and it's not wrong to ask. I think that's the most important thing. It's not wrong to ask.
Absolutely. And it's the reason why we're having this conversation right now, because I was kind of in the same boat as you. I was one of those people who were like, just go get the vaccines. Like, why are you like not vaccinating your child? It makes no sense.
Yeah, I was too, Nikki, if I could jump in on that. I mean, my kids are fully vaccinated. The only one that I thought twice about was rotavirus, and it was right around the time of the intussusception, and we lived right near Marine Corps base, and I knew that if my child got severe diarrhea, I could get him rehydrated really fast. So I actually said, no, we're not going to do that one. But every other vaccine my children have had, including first doses of HPV, and one of my sons had both doses of the COVID vaccine, and the younger one had the first dose. So I am the kind of person who will weigh risks and benefits and look for that optimal, dosing scheme that reflects my child's unique set of risks. I think tying on to what Ram was saying about honesty and disclosure, and what you were saying, Nikki, about trust, being reinforced and actually underscored with honesty and transparency. I just wanted to point out a few things that give me pause with respect to how our trials are currently being conducted, and HPV offers a good example of that. Yep. The short follow-up time of the studies was 5 to 10 years now at the maximum, but the median time to develop cancer was 23.5 years. So that was known at the time that these were licensed, right? The screening intervals in the studies were 6 to 12 months. Versus, a typical 36-month screening interval, pap smears. So that would overestimate, because these things naturally resolve within about 2 to 3 years, that would overestimate the benefit of the vaccine if we happen to catch a dip, which would have been naturally occurring
anyway. Let's rewind a little bit for the room. So when you say the screening interval, do you mean the screening interval for the vaccine itself, like, the immunogenicity, or screening
in the
time of dosing, screening the child for the actual disease itself?
Comparing both. So within the trial, screening 6 to 12 months, looking for persistent infection, 6 to 12 months versus the typical 36 months, which is when we normally do pap screening. So I think that, given that these naturally resolve 90% of them, the CDC says within 2 to 3 years, the body naturally fights it off with mucosal immunity. I think that it's concerning that, we were compressing the timeline for reviewing and approving these vaccines to such a short period of time. And that includes the serious adverse events as well. When you have a constellation of odd post-vaccination events that are in multi-organ systems and just don't pop as like a very obvious, for instance, fainting was found. It's very difficult to diagnose. It takes a long time. It takes a really educated clinician to put all the pieces together and say, yeah, this looks like it could have been related to the vaccine, and we just don't have enough time. It's 3 to 6 months. Ram was asking typically for looking at the SAEs. So the compression of time, I think, is a challenge for some of these things. And if we were to be really honest and ask our regulators to really do good due diligence prior to licensure, we would take into account the natural course of the illness and the disease progression when we're looking at comparing vaccinated and unvaccinated people. That's just a couple. I had a couple other thoughts to throw out there, but I don't want to go too fast.
No, and
Well,
this
the
is
one
good.
thing I would add too, though, to this, if you don't mind me just popping in, is that because you brought up the issue of syncope, for example, one of the problems that arises in this is there's a certain frequency bias that comes up. And what I mean by that is that people have non-specific symptoms that aren't necessarily targeted to any one single organ system that are kind of honestly a little bit protean. And everyone wants to attach that to the most recent event in their life that may have happened. And it's a classic case of association is not causation. But even more than that, a lot of these symptoms are so vague. And I'm not saying they're not real, they're very real for the person experiencing them, that whether or not they have a true physiologic basis, they're vague enough that you can't exactly, on almost many, in a vast majority of cases, pinpoint exactly what led to that particular symptom or those consistent set of symptoms. And people point to ongoing symptoms like malaise and fatigue, these sorts of things, which can be very real for the person, but may not have an actual somatic basis, meaning an actual organic disease basis. So I think we need to be very careful about how we establish causality. And that's actually, it's an important methodological point. So for example, looking at the 10-year follow-up study for the HPV vaccine that was recently released, I was looking at the rate, and we want to look for what we call falsification endpoints. And what I mean is you want to look for something that would have nothing to do with the vaccine in particular, and you'd want to see that particular thing be equal in both populations. And Alli will bring up the point, and she brought it up in our conversations in email, that without an actual placebo control group, it can be hard to do this. And not only that, when you do have a placebo quote unquote control group, if it's not a randomized group, they may have underlying biases and reflect this bias. So for example, in that 10-year follow-up study, it's a little hard to convert from what they call person years to absolute risk, but they were looking at the risk of chlamydia in this group. And it was something like, if I can't remember the exact numbers, and I have to go look at the study, but it ended up looking like it was about 4 to 5 times less than the incidence of chlamydia in the general population. Again, it's difficult to convert from person years to, if I look at a statistic for risk in 20-year-olds, it's not a direct comparison. But if we do sort of like a divide by 5 for every 100 person years that are in the study and look at a 20-year-old, it was quite a bit lower. What does that mean? I don't know. These people have different sexual behavior. We know that the type of sexual behavior you engage in deeply affects your HPV risk. For presumably this is completely intuitive for everyone. It's an STD, but these are really
and it's
important
someone
points.
who got the vaccine more likely to have riskier, sexual activity, or less likely to have because they're interested in preventing, illness.
Right.
Their health. We don't know the answer to that, right?
No.
Yeah.
And in some cases, like in the Swedish study, the vaccinated group has a healthy vaccine effect, where they actually had, higher socioeconomic status. And the lack of, controlling for other things like smoking, which is correlated with HPV infection and disease progression. And Ram knows me. I get like curious about something and I can't help myself. I start to dig in, just really wondering about the mechanism there with tobacco. I think it's something that people should be really curious about, especially with regard to vaping, because benzopyrene, from what I could tell at least, might be one of the 2,000 chemicals in vaping. And I think we should get curious about oral cancer and HPV there, because we do know all the way back to 2008 that it was part of the mechanism of action that allowed for the HPV vaccine to amplify its genome and create the little virion. So I'm curious enough about tobacco and vaping that I wonder about that as a very substantial risk factor for HPV disease progression and cervical cancer. And that was not controlled for in these population-based studies. They just could not, I guess, get the data. I don't know, but that's the underscores the importance of randomized controlled trials, because theoretically, these things that are really tough to control for are randomized across the group. So they're similar. Even if we can't mathematically control for them, they're similar in both groups, the vaccine group and the unvaccinated group. And I don't recall seeing that in the RCTs. And I would like to go back to these, vague symptoms that Ram was mentioning. Yeah, they're really difficult to diagnose. And like you said, Ram, they are very real for people. And my heart goes out to people who have been affected, they think, by the HPV vaccine. Again, I'm not saying they were or they weren't. There's actually a trial starting in September 2024, so next month, against Merck. I've met with some of these folks who are, claim to be vaccine injured. I don't say claim because I'm discounting it. I say I don't know. I don't know enough about it. But, these are very real conditions. And Jorgensen, Gitche, and Jefferson, in one of their publications, went back to all of the clinical study reports, grabbed extra stuff from the manufacturers, and got extra data from these randomized controlled trials and tried to dig into these serious adverse events. So Jefferson is in the Cochrane group, right, doing the Cochrane reviews that you all recognize that name. And they found that, the number needed to harm was statistically significant, even with an RCT, for serious nervous system disorders. And the number needed to harm, again, statistically significant for general harm. So I do think there's something there. I can't say what it is. I can't say it with any assurance, but these were, even in an RCT setting with not a ton of people, but somewhere around 20,000 people, it did pop statistically. I think it's worth looking at. I don't think that, people are making stuff up and there's nothing there, which gets back to who's really at risk, who should be getting how many doses.
Yeah.
And, I think it's
before
important
you
that
move
we
on to that,
get to
because that is important. I do still want to stay on this topic, though, of side effects and how we look at them and how we figure out how we determine which things are, side effects that are attributed to, the vaccine. And specifically, I remember hearing the reports about the syncopal episodes in clinic, in offices. And so when my oldest got her very first dose, this was, about 10 years after, her pediatrician wanted to keep her in the office and just, let her sit there for 15, 20 minutes or so to make sure that she wouldn't stand up and get this syncopal episode. So when we're telling people that these risks aren't necessarily attributed to the vaccine, or possibly are, you have parents who, parents and preteen and teenagers who are being given this information. And so what do parents do? They talk to other parents, right? And so you create this chain of people who are nervous, basically, and anxious about side effects and issues. And then if we don't really know what's causing it, but we're also at the same time telling people, okay, we still need you to sit here for 15 or 20 minutes and be observed, so that, you don't faint on us. Then are we really saying to them, that this is a side effect? Or are we saying I think the information can just be very confusing for the lay person. And
well, it is 82 per million.
Yeah. And when you're also in a position where you're not really sure who to trust or what information to trust, that to me just compounds the whole situation. And so I wonder then what we need to be doing. And that is two things. One is, what should we be doing differently in how we determine what are adverse events? And then we can go into VAERS and talk about what is actually the way we do this now. And then when we do determine it, how do we inform people? What is that process like? Or what should we be doing? So that's kind of where I want to go with this part of the discussion. And then let's talk about the actual effects.
Well, can I just really broadly say that I empathize with people who are nervous and anxious, but I think also one of the reasons that I've shifted into supporting people as a professional coach is because of anxiety and depression. And I think that the underlying anxiety and depression in our culture, in our society right now, is not good for the nervous system. Like, just let's start there. So, I think if we can start to understand our physiology first and how that affects our psychology, then whatever small risks are going to come our way, whether it's vaccines or anything else. Me talking to you all tonight had me a little anxious, right? I have to learn how to manage my own physiology so that doesn't push me over the edge and cause my, immune system to take a hit unnecessarily. And so I can be fully present with you and really keep my wits about me and share what I know with you guys in a balanced and measured way. And I think that just backing all the way up to how do we support people in doing that, through exercise, through good nutrition, through, breathing, taking a deep breath every now and then, honestly, helps reset the vagal nerve and it's connected to your diaphragm. Could that help with post-vaccination syndromes? Potentially. I mean, there is some evidence that, people who have a parasympathetic burden, their parasympathetic system is constantly running to try to offset the sympathetic, which is the fight or flight, could have, more likelihood of having some of these non-specific issues. And that's, I think, an area of research that should be further explored. And I know people who are working on supporting people with vaccine injuries along those lines, neurological disorders. So yeah, it's maybe a little bit out there as far as inquiry. It's not an area have any expertise in, but I think it's worth considering for overall health and well-being.
Yeah.
I think one thing I'll say is I don't know. So Alli, you forwarded the study from the Columbia group, Columbia as in the country, COLO, that looked at the HPV vaccine, Gardasil, and outcomes. And do you recall the paper I'm talking about from Maldonado?
I read that one last week, so I can't say with any specificity.
Yeah, no, it's really recent. I'm not even sure it's actually been formally published yet. I didn't see a publication date or volume. But it's due to come out soon. But it's a great study, actually, and it's a great example of how not everything has to be an RCT. When you get very large data sets like they had, which honestly I was really impressed by. I don't think we'd have anything comparable in the US, which just says a lot. But anyway, it was a very interesting analysis. The paper was written in a responsible fashion. And statistically, it was interesting as well. And what they basically had, and I can pull it up, is that they have these huge data sets where they're able to compare cohorts and events in 46,000 vaccinees versus, say, 363,000. It looks like I'm just giving an example of unvaccinated. So the point is about 45,000 or so on one arm, and then about 350,000 in the other arm. And these are all retrospective cohorts. And they also performed a really interesting analysis where they required a threshold level of events to say that this is an event that might be an event of interest. In fact, so if the events were very low, and they somewhat arbitrarily used the count of 5, if we were lower than that, then it wasn't really considered a significant enough event to actually calculate an odds ratio on. Because there's one thing I can say with certainty, they identified 4 different things, and specifically rheumatoid arthritis, both juvenile and adult onset juvenile idiopathic, thyrotoxicosis, and something called idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura. And they found significant odds ratios there. The confidence intervals, for example, always stayed above 1, which suggested, that might be a real signal. But the absolute risk was still very, very low. And we're talking on the order of events of, like, in some cases, like 8 out of 33, about 34,000. And you can go ahead and do the percentages on that. But the point is, they were very transparent about how they reported things. And I'll say one thing. I trust authors who show you absolute risk and their relative risk calculations, because if they're only showing you one or the other, they're trying to feed you something. They're not letting you look at the data, and they're not letting you perform what is a reasonable analysis, because you can find all sorts of relative risks that demonstrate significant increases, but the absolute risk is so low, it's not even worth trying to calculate it And yeah, it also means your confidence intervals are going to look like hell. They're going to be all over the place. So it's a good paper. It's worth reading. You might want to show a link to it in your for your audience. But those are the kind of analyses that we should be doing. We should be able to have large prospective data sets on these patients that we then hold. There's no technical barrier to this. Haven't been for decades. There's no technical barrier to this. And to have these data sets and look at them over time. What we shouldn't do is drive parents who have questions into chat rooms where they're going to encounter other parents with about a 1,000-fold increased probability of having had the same event, and they create this echo chamber around something that isn't a thing.
Yeah.
And I quite mean it, that these sort of non-specific symptoms that they then attribute to this medical intervention, and it's just, but they've created this availability or frequency bias, and they're all kind of reinforcing one another, and it goes to your point. That's what we shouldn't do, is drive people to self-diagnosis and rumination in chat rooms.
Yeah. And I think that part of what we're doing, though, when we tell people, okay, this is a possibility, or this maybe what we're seeing that's related to the vaccine, and we don't really follow up and do great research like the study you just pointed out, to really get that information to people, and then we just have this vague reporting system that is voluntary, then that's what we have, that's what we were left with. And in an age where we have social media, we have a way for someone within like 30 seconds to get on and find a Facebook group and talk to other parents about this, and this information can get spread. The panic can rise rapidly. And so I think we need to be doing something, obviously a lot more responsibly, to help people understand what the real risks are, of everything, pretty much. And we need to be transparent about it. And so I love the example you just gave, was a perfect illustration of how to do that properly. And so,
or at least try.
Yeah, or at least try to do it, right? And then not really. I mean, absolutely, people, people need to know that we don't need a randomized control. You can't even use a randomized control trial for certain types of studies. Like, that's not, it's a goal.
They wouldn't be approved. It just wouldn't be approved. It would not be IRB approved.
Yeah. And so that's the thing. So was this a good study for what we're studying and how we, and the information that we need to get? Then that's what people need to know. They don't need to know, like, we don't need to scare people and say this wasn't an RCT, so I can't say this was a great study. Like, we just need to give people information. That's really what it is. And so along the while we're still on the kind of the side effect topic, though, Stud PC, who has a question for us in the chat, and says, excellent discussion. Thank you to all of you. The Gardasil FDA label states that the severe adverse event rate is 2.3%. Where are we getting that rate? Just 1 in 2,500 from? I think that might have been something that you stated, Alli. Why wasn't an inactive placebo used in the trials? And do we really know the potential long-term effects from the HPV vaccine? And I think we were going to get into the long-term effects, and from what we know from data in a minute. But do you want to address that serious adverse event rate question?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I believe 2.3% was a subset of the safety cohort. I believe that was the autoimmune conditions. And because that's a small subset of the larger safety cohort, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't reread the package insert, I apologize. But I'm happy to reread that and add further clarification later. The 0.04% is what I'm focusing on because it's a larger group, and I like to be conservative if possible. 2.3% is a very sizable SAE rate.
Yeah.
And, I think that would have its own, I'd have some concerns about that, how generalizable that is. And generally speaking, 0.04% is actually concerning enough to me because it lines up pretty well with how many we would need to vaccinate to prevent one cervical cancer, being 2,300 or so compared to 2,500. So I think that there's, even with the smaller number, 0.04%, I think that there's enough justification to be really cautious and look at this a bit more carefully. And it'll be interesting to see what we can learn from the trial that's coming up through Discovery, see if there's any other documents that can shed light on this.
Okay. Well, looking at the Columbia study, just to round out the response, that was interesting. Like all the 4 events that met their threshold criteria for inclusion as being sort of eligible for reasonable odds ratios calculations were all autoimmune. There were 4 autoimmune conditions. And again, the absolute risk was very low, well below anything even close to 1%, or 0.1% even, honestly. So, meaning 0.01. So and the nice thing about this retrospective cohort is they also had the ability to link these diagnoses and create a validation with specialty visits, possible gold standard test, which is debatable because some of these don't clearly have a gold standard test. But an attempt to actually not just pick up a random signal or sort of like a self-reported efficacy or self-reported event, but something that was actually validated with actual sentinel medical testing and or visits, which I thought was very powerful. And I'm just astonished that they have that kind of data at that level of granularity, honestly.
I think it's a good study. I do note that it only went out 360 days.
It did,
so.
Yeah. I mean, but still, I mean, the point is the methodology is in place now that if they were to take this out and reanalyze it every year on forward, they could do that. And it might show new trends. It might blunt out any trends they saw. I'm more impressed with the methodology and the dedication to actually gathering this information, honestly.
So how do we get our scientific institutions and our regulatory bodies to see that, like the importance?
Well, to me, this is an ethical and a funding question. Yeah. I don't understand why it's ever okay. And I'll say it again. I don't understand why it's ever okay for an FDA commissioner or FDA panel member to take a job in the pharmaceutical industry afterwards. I don't understand why that's ever okay. You sign on and you say, this means I'll never work in pharma. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's one of the prerequisites of this job. The notion somehow that we won't get the best and the brightest is laughable. That won't happen. Yeah. We ain't getting them now. Yeah. So it's not as if that'll stop it anyway.
And in a country that has, these stark laws that physicians
hundreds of millions,
that we have to comply with, like we have to report on the CMS website every single year the $5 that we got for a lunch from a pharmaceutical company.
Well, no, I mean it's at the point like
these other people don't have to report these conflicts of interest so openly.
It's crazy. Mm-hmm. No, it's crazy. And quite frankly, at my academic medical center, at my community hospital, and I think this is generally a good thing. I mean, I never lived in the era, I was never practiced in the era where you would get trips and all these sorts of fancy perks that supposedly happened in the past from pharmaceutical companies. I never experienced that. But I did experience the person coming in and bringing cookies or burritos or sandwiches or whatever. Well,
Yeah, I participated in a clinical trial, and they, when they come to teach you out the trial, they will, take you to a central location, and they do cover everything. They cover your lodging, they cover your, meals and that kind of thing. So,
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, they do that.
I've never done that.
Yeah.
But like the interesting thing is what all of the places I work have done is since that era of when I used to get cookies and a lunch or something and, that valuable pen or whatever, silly. Yeah. But the point is that nothing that I ever viewed as influencing my prescribing patterns is fine. It doesn't matter. All the institutions I work at, including the non-academic ones, have said pharma people are not allowed on campus, period. You're not allowed to do in-services. You're not allowed to do anything. You want to do something off campus, that's up to you. But you can't do stuff in our practice environment or our academic environment. And I
Yeah.
thought, okay, fine, whatever. I don't think I was ever influenced by a sandwich, but having said that, nothing wrong with this. I'm
Right.
good with it. But
Exactly.
somehow it's okay at these same institutions for pharmaceutical companies to sign huge monetary agreements for the running of clinical trials that I don't know what the compensation levels are. They're not trivial. I know that. They're certainly
Yeah.
supporting a lot of FTEs at the campus. I know
Yeah.
that, from
Yeah.
which the university derives some indirect cost benefit and so forth.
Yeah.
But that's okay.
Yep.
And I don't get that. I
Right.
really don't
Right.
understand that. And I'm just asking for that to be divorced. And whether that's at an academic center, a medical center, or if it's at the level of the FDA, I think that's a prerequisite. This needs to stop. In the same
Right.
way that I don't feel like anyone who serves in Congress should be allowed to actively trade stock.
Yeah. Right.
It's honestly
Exactly.
very similar.
Yes, exactly. Yep, I totally agree. All right. So yes, so let's get back to like the vaccine. We know like it's recommended for it's recommended for the first it's a 3-dose, correct? The 9-valent is a 3-dose
If you
series.
start at age 15, if you
Okay.
vaccinate on schedule with CDC's recommendation age 11 or 12, it's
Okay.
2 doses separated by 6 to 12 months. I would
Okay.
love to get to the reasonable parents' take on this, if that's okay.
Yeah.
What does the
Let's
reasonable
let's
parents
get
do?
there. Yep, exactly.
So, and Ram, please, you're a parent, of older kids and now younger kids, so you've got a great bookends on this. The reasonable parent, I came to. I've been looking at this last year in grape debt, and again this year, just trying to update myself on what I think, and my conclusion's the same. The World Health Organization updated their recommendations in 2022 that 1 dose seems to be sufficient, and the research is backing that up. 1 dose seems to be protective. So
Okay.
I think you might maximize the good with 1 dose and minimize the potential harms, however rare that they are. And then if you also consider the risk factors, so age at first coitus. So if you can delay sexual activity until later, if you can reduce the number of sexual partners, obesity is related, tobacco, as I mentioned also before, is a risk factor. So, think about your overall health. Are you able to go in for HPV testing? They can do swabs now, and even self-swabbing is coming to see if you are even infected and with what strains of HPV. So I think a lot of things are changing that make it possible for a parent to even decide, no, we're going to take a pass on this one. But if you're going to take a pass on the vaccine, be aware that you really should go looking for other strategies to minimize risk, like HPV testing. Like, make sure you're not saying no to something and not also saying yes to something else. Have to
Yeah.
be reasonable.
Yeah. And that should be a part of the informed consent process, correct? So if you're in the position where you're prescribing this vaccination, and the parents ask you, what are my alternatives to not taking it, or not allowing my child to take it, then that should be discussed. It shouldn't be a yes or no, well, we can't see you in our clinic anymore if you don't want to take this, this
Yeah.
particular vaccine. There may be some that people worry about contagion and spread of disease, that kind of thing. But this is the information that parents should be getting. And I think it's off-putting to people when you tell them absolutely no, this is it. This is you either take this or you don't take this. You're taking away some sense of autonomy and medical freedom away from people, for one. And two, you are actually introducing just a barrier between yourself and your judgment and your patient care. And so I think that is detrimental to the whole process in the first place. So I absolutely think that needs to be a part of the informed consent process. And now that we have reasonable data that says that 1 dose, is sufficient, that needs to change too. So I'm hoping that the parents who are watching this are getting those kind of practical tips from you guys, and just us having this discussion. So, because we're not saying, okay, oh, absolutely, go ahead and get this, all of these, doses of vaccines and do exactly what your pediatrician says. We want you to have all the information, and we want you to feel empowered to be able to, go and ask the questions that need to be asked. So what do we know? What do we know now? We've had, obviously 10 years. So what is the kind of the population-based study average on how much disease that we've been preventing since we started giving this vaccine?
Well, in the UK, in Denmark, I believe, and in Sweden, there have been several population-based cohort studies that have come out trying to look at what's happened over 10 years. And it's looking like somewhere between 88 to 90% reduction in cervical cancer, which sounds phenomenal. And I'm not saying I don't believe it, but I also want to think about what has also been happening at the same time. So high-risk sexual behaviors have been declining at the same time. So we have to take that into account. People actually have been listening to what they learn in phys ed and health class. And that is true around the world, not just in the US. So that's happening in the background.
And maybe their parents.
Yeah. And, unfortunately, and I'm not, all joking aside, people are lonely right now. And, I think that we have bigger concerns than, and this may sound heretical, I apologize, but we have bigger concerns on our plates than, one extremely rare serious adverse event due to getting one vaccine. I really think that, the thinking parent realizes that, a child's health is so multifaceted, and we can do a lot to optimize their ability to handle any immunological assault by getting them outside, getting sunshine, proper nutrition, good protein, excellent sleep. I mean, this may sound stupid to reiterate all of this, but
no, it doesn't.
From what I'm seeing in my practice with people is these basics are not really, first and foremost on people's minds, and they do affect depression and ADHD symptoms. So, the reasonable parent, I think, has a very wide angle view, very large aperture on these topics.
Yeah, I love that. Like that's like perfect. Because I mean, if we're talking about preventive health, then
yeah. Sorry to go old school.
That absolutely needs to be on the prescription there. That's my medical unsolicited.
Well, I mean, really, the first half of sleep, Ram, you can jump in there. First half of sleep is all about, cellular repair. So if you're lifting, you're an athlete, whatever, don't go to bed late. The first half of your sleep, that non-REM sleep, is about repairing your body. And then the second half of your sleep is about new skill building and emotional regulation. First half of sleep is repairing the body, including immunology and also memory consolidation. So, minimum 7 hours, and just start there. Just start with 7 hours and see how that improves your overall health picture.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a complicated topic. I mean, I'm an emergency physician of more than 2 decades, 23, 20, 24 years, and my sleep is destroyed. So it's a matter of understanding what you can do with your sleep, and that's a whole different topic. But
and you're a parent of children right now too.
Yeah.
Sleep is never normal.
No. But I get somewhat shielded from that, but still, I think, you asked me what is a reasonable parent take on this, and I have to be honest with you, I don't know right now. I think it really depends on the vaccine. It depends on the disease. It depends on the vaccine. It depends on, what is your kid's risk, right? So they've gotten all of them. So I don't really think about it, but I have serious questions when someone sort of enthusiastically claps for a pan-corona vaccine. What does that mean? Like, I don't, so it's, there's 220 some odd respiratory viruses out there. What's our goal? There's some inherent risk to participating in society. What's our goal? So and that's just having that contact, so I don't know what the reasonable answer is. What do I want to see as a physician scientist? I want to see, for the audience, there's survival curves that compare 2 different cohorts over time. For the initiated, I want to see Kaplan-Meier curves over time. I want them to run for a long period of time. I want someone to do those data sets to demonstrate that data. And I want to see the Kaplan-Meier curves with absolute risk counts along those curves. That's what I want to see. And I want to see that for everything. And to the extent that, I'm the more I look at vaccines, the reason why I think a lot of the sort of the 1-dose argument you're presenting, Alli, may ultimately end up being where we land, aside from cost and the ability to roll these out to larger global populations and what have you, is that I'm becoming increasingly sort of unimpressed with just single point immunogenicity data. That's antibody levels aren't how the immune system works over time. They are in the moment. That's called the reaction. And what over time, they aren't necessarily. So if you look at the immunogenicity data for the 10-year follow-up of the HPV recipients, they have to use increasing levels of sensitivity to actually capture measurable IgG levels in all of the people who receive the vaccine. That's not bad. It just emphasizes the notion that it isn't just about the antibody level. So it really shouldn't be about the antibody level at the time of approval either. I mean, you need to have some sort of immunogenicity. If it's doing absolutely nothing,
Right.
but if it's even doing a little something, maybe that's enough in terms of individual risk protection. Maybe that's enough. And then you'd like to see what it does from a societal standpoint. Like, in other words, there's two ways to blunt the impact of a disease on society. There's I get the disease and I transmit it, or I get the disease, but I don't really transmit it because I had some vaccine and I really isolate it, right? My body does a great isolating it.
Yeah.
So in one case, so there are different mechanisms to transmission reduction as well, and measuring that societal impact. It's a complicated and interesting question.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is what's the end point of all of this? Is it longevity, longevity, living a full, healthy life too? It can't just, is it just about, kind of preventing, the spread of
Is it only
disease?
disease
Because
avoidance? Right.
if we spread the common cold, more, there's more people are not going to be horribly sick and die from it, and it actually may have some great effects of building up their immune system. Yes, does it increase the risk of people who are already at risk of getting serious illness? Yes, probably, for the most part. Yes, but our goal is longevity and healthy human beings, and so that's what we really should be focusing on, I think, and all the things that Alli, you talked about and you focused on.
Could I add to what
saying,
Ram said? Ram had such a great kind of wrap up with what he'd like to see. I'd like to see a few things too. Yes, it will cost some money, but we have the money. I'd like to see trials that have more than 5,000 people in them, at least maybe 10,000, so we can actually pick up these serious adverse events at a reasonable number. The trials with 2,000 or 3,000 in it is just silliness. It's absolutely bonkers that we allow that to happen. I'd like to see them a little bit longer duration trials so that we can have a reasonable periodicity of picking up the natural course of the disease we're trying to prevent. I'd like to see complete reporting of the SAEs. Only 60 to 70% were actually reported in the Merck trial, according to publications that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. So complete reporting of these SAEs and true placebos. I know this is a controversial suggestion, but I would actually like to see some true placebos, not in the HPV trials. They were comparing the vaccine group. The placebo group actually got the adjuvant, which is very immunogenic itself. So I would actually love to think about ethically, how can we do a true placebo-controlled trial for at least some of these folks? And then Ram brought up immunogenicity and antibodies. It's not all antibodies. We learned that during COVID. I mean, these T cells are the ones who actually provoke the antibody response. It's the T cells that are roaming around and on guard, and that's true for HPV as well. So I think we need to be a little more sophisticated in our understanding and testing for what's actually happening during the immune response to natural infection as well as post-vaccination. And we have no correlate of protection. I was dreaming about this last night, preparing for you. Do we have a correlate of protection? We don't for HPV. We don't know what a specific antibody level is that we might need. So it's not very helpful.
Wow. Yes. Okay. So that's exactly the way I wanted you to round this out and summarize it. And I think is excellent. I think that people watching this are going to get a lot of great information, a lot of practical information. And I think just the recommendation for us to move forward in society and for us to be able to kind of restore some of the trust here. Those were excellent recommendations. I think that's exactly what we need. And so that's that's all I have. You answered all the questions that I wanted, and the topics that I wanted to get through. Is there anything else you want to add before I kind of close out discussion? Either of you?
No, I think my wish list is if that could just be
Yes,
someone take that seriously, that would be amazing. I've been banging and beating the drum for more than 2,000 people in an RCT would be fantastic.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, we're saying, is this is a funding issue, but these are initial trials that we're talking about, and these are done by the pharmaceutical companies, and so they're not hurting for money. We know that. So like that, to me, I think that's something that we can easily solve, but we have to be demanding that information and then that transparency. And the other, this actually reminds me, I wanted to ask you a very specific question, Ram, about so for the physicians who aren't computational scientists, who aren't epidemiologists, who go down these deep rabbit holes and look at all of this information, who are just in general practicing, seeing their patients and making these recommendations. What advice do you have for who should they be going to for information to provide informed consent to their
So that's a great question. As I said, I think it's too much to ask every physician to know all of this or analyze it, and it wouldn't even really be appropriate. I think what I would say, where not to go. Where not to go is the lay press. Definitely not where to go. Where not to go in your practice, be open-minded. Don't be judgmental. I have a colleague who I consider a very dear colleague. He's a great person, very experienced physician, great clinician. But during COVID in 2021, after the vaccine rolled out, he, as an emergency physician, he developed, and this was when, you had all the people telling you, and you'll see why I'm getting to this, telling you that it was going to stop transmission and that you're 99%, 95%, some version of 9 something or other percent protected. And if you get COVID, you're not going to pass it on. If you're that, blah, blah, blah. We all heard this. But those of us who are aware that that was going to be the end point of this knew that in early 2021. We were watching the data, but other people who really weren't paying attention would not necessarily have been, right? And what he did, without, again, I'm not getting the names and stuff, and he's a very good person, a very good physician. But he developed these laminated pieces of paper, and he'd go in and ask people whether or not they got the COVID vaccine. And if they hadn't, he would kind of flip through them and say, "Who do you want to kill?" And he would show these to them. And
yikes.
That there's no reason for that. And it's sort of like an approach that's born out of a poor understanding of the data and a poor understanding of the gaps in understanding, and a reliance on on the lay press and what he was presenting as his data, citing things from that one journalist, Apurva Mandavili, I think that's what her name is, who was a disaster on all things COVID, reflecting the general misinformation that was more common in the New York Times probably than any other publication on the topic. But I think what I would say is just be open-minded and don't be judgmental in either direction.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if I could add this, parents should take some solace in knowing that kids age 2 to 3 or so, that's like their peak of their immune system's robustness. Not to say that it's terrible later at all, but that's a peak time. And they're bound to get sick. The number of colds is 8 to 12 or so in that per year. So getting sick is a normal thing. That's how they're building immunity. And mucosal immunity is something that we didn't talk about much during the pandemic. And I can still bring it up today. And it really doesn't get that much attention, but it's actually the first defense. And it's good to know as we head into flu season that, that is how your body builds immunity. And it's an important way of building immunity. So I think for parents, where do they go to? Often parents will ask me on Twitter, and it's difficult because I can't give clinical advice. I'm not a doctor.
Yeah.
I'm just a thinking mom with the same questions that they have. But the first dose of any series of vaccines is what gets the immune system to pay attention. The rest are booster doses. They're intended to either boost the antibodies, again, how many do we actually really need, and or seroconvert those who did not seroconvert before, which is really what that second dose of MMR is about. And so these are population-based decisions, not individual decisions. And I think that's where it comes in, you know, man, you'd be lucky to find a clinician like Ram that you could actually sit down and have a conversation with, right?
Right.
And so reasonable parents, think about how, you know, you're interacting with your own clinician. Are they open-minded? If not, don't judge them. They're doing the best they can, but shop around until you find someone you can have a conversation with, and watch how they prescribe antibiotics would be a good measure of just how measured they are. I see Ram nodding. He probably has more to add there, but I think it's a good litmus test.
Well, no, I will say the following. It's deeply ironic that physicians who properly adhere to decreased use of antibiotics are completely uncritical in their approach to other pharmaceuticals. That I think that's fascinating, because now the data is really interesting about decreased antibiotic use. It's not just about decreasing community resistance patterns, but even in that individual, if you tailor the antibiotic use to a lower, sort of less broad spectrum sort of agents, more targeted agents, or less frequent administration, you can decrease their burden of resistant organisms. This is a finding. It's a big deal, meaning it's not just about the community, it's about that person as well.